Imagine you were born in 13th century France. You don't steal, you don't kill. But one day you whisper a dangerous idea. Maybe the church is wrong. That alone could get you tortured, excommunicated, or burned alive. In medieval times, heresy wasn't just a disagreement. It was treason against God. This is the story of what happened when your beliefs didn't match the church's, and why you wouldn't survive as a heretic. The word heresy comes from the Greek heresis, meaning choice. But in the eyes of the church, it wasn't just a choice, it was a rebellion. Heresy meant holding any belief that opposed official church doctrine. You could believe Jesus was purely divine, not human, and suddenly you were branded a heretic. Or say you questioned transubstantiation, the idea that bread literally becomes the body of Christ during communion. That was enough. In the early centuries, church councils, like the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, defined what was true. Everything else was false and dangerous. But heresy wasn't just a spiritual issue, it threatened the church's authority. And when belief becomes power, belief becomes deadly. The medieval Catholic Church wasn't just a place of worship, it was the supreme authority on earth, governing education, law, land, kings, and souls. Defying the church wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. To the church, heresy threatened the very fabric of Christian society. Pope Gregory IX declared, "Anyone who lets a heretic live is himself a heretic." In the eyes of the faithful, heretics didn't just hold false beliefs, they endangered eternal salvation for everyone around them, and that justified extreme measures. In the 12th century, a quiet revolution was happening. Groups like the Cathars and Waldensians were growing, and they had ideas the church didn't approve of. The Cathars, for example, believed in a dualistic universe, a good spiritual God and an evil material world. They rejected wealth, war, and the church's corruption. That made them enemies of the state and enemies of God. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade against them. Entire towns were slaughtered. A church leader was asked how to tell heretics from true Christians. He said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." To root out surviving heretics, the church created a new weapon, the Inquisition, a system of judges, friars, and secret informants devoted entirely to hunting and punishing heresy. If you were accused of heresy, you weren't given a lawyer. You weren't allowed to know who accused you. And silence, that was considered guilt. The church believed that confession was essential for saving your soul. And if you wouldn't confess willingly, they would help you. Torture was sanctioned by papal decree. You might be tied behind your back and hoisted by your wrists, at a technique called strappado, or stretched until your joints dislocated on the rack, or have your feet crushed in iron boots. The goal wasn't truth, it was obedience, and once you confessed, your fate was sealed. If the church found you guilty, there were consequences, some symbolic, some brutal. You might be forced to wear a yellow cross in public, or march barefoot through town while flogged, but the worst punishment was death by fire. Burning was seen as purifying, a way to cleanse the heretic's soul by destroying the body. It wasn't just about death, it was about spectacle. One of the most famous victims was Jan Hus, a Czech priest who criticised church corruption. He was promised safe passage to a church council, and then burned alive in 1415. Heresy wasn't just about theology, it was deeply gendered. Women, especially those who lived alone or practiced folk healing, were prime targets. By the late Middle Ages, heresy accusations blurred into witchcraft trials. The 1487 book Malleus Maleficarum declared that women were more susceptible to the devil. Entire villages were swept up in hysteria. These women weren't priests or theologians, but in a world where belief was tightly controlled, even midwives and herbalists became enemies of the faith. Over the centuries, many brave or foolish souls stood up to church power and paid dearly. Giordano Bruno believed in infinite worlds and a God beyond Catholic doctrine, burned alive in 1600. Joan of Arc claimed to speak with angels, tried and executed in 1431. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English so common people could read it, strangled, then burned. John Wycliffe died of a stroke, but the church later dug up his remains and burned them anyway. For these individuals, truth mattered more than life, but the price was eternal flame. In medieval Europe, heresy wasn't an act, it was an idea. One stray thought, one whispered doubt. That's all it took. Torture, confession, fire. The church offered salvation, but only if you obeyed, and so most stayed silent. Not because they believed, but because they wanted to live. The first step toward truth is the most dangerous.